Well, God bless you. My name is Mike Lorence. It's November 7th, 2021. And I'm sitting here in Round Lake Beach, Illinois at a Sunday morning fellowship, but I'm also on Zoom with people in Rockford and other areas, and enjoying the fellowship with Zoom too, while Charlie is down in El Salvador, wrapping up his time down there with Steve James. So it's a real blessing to be here. Charlie asked me if I would handle the fellowship for him this past week where Sheila taught, and this week. So he'll be coming back tomorrow. So be wonderful to be back on their regular schedule and seeing Charlie. I'm sure he's got some tremendous things he'll be sharing with all of you when he gets back. Well, I've titled the teaching, In God We Trust, the Believer's Motto. And I thought about this based on a conversation I actually had with Reverend Bob Cardin just a couple days ago. We were talking about trusting in God. And one of the things that Bob had mentioned is sometimes we say we trust in God, but we really don't do what God says. We either act out of ignorance or we act out of bravado. Sometimes we say we're going to trust God, but when God is maybe encouraging us to go a different direction, because we want to prove that we're trusting God, we think we have to do it a certain way. And that's not trusting God. That's either ignorance or arrogance. And we don't want to be in either one of those. Neither one of those is a good place to be. So as I thought about that conversation I had with Bob, I thought, you know what, I'm going to put together this teaching on trust and trusting God. And so I titled again, In God We Trust, the Believer's Motto. Do you know what a motto is? Many schools have them. Adopted in 1692, Harvard University's original motto was Veritas Christo et Ecclesia. Now, I don't speak Latin, but that's my best Kansas twang version of it. So you have to give me a little break on my Kansas Latin. But that's Latin for truth for Christ and the church. Now, originally it was set up as a seminary, and it is the oldest university in the United States of America. I think it was established in like 1630 something, but again, don't hold me to the dates. It's been around a long time. They've now shortened that to just Veritas, which is just truth. No longer, they took out for Christ and the church is out of there. It's no longer part of their motto. How many of you know what the Boy Scout motto was or is?
Be prepared.
Be prepared, right? That's the Boy Scout motto. And how about the United States Marine Corps?
Always faithful. Semper Fidelis.
Semper Fidelis, always faithful. So those are just a few mottos that we've all been familiar with, and maybe you've heard others. According to Merriam-Webster, it's either one, a sentence, phrase, or word inscribed as something on something as appropriate to or indicative of its character or use. Let me say that again. It's either number one, sentence, phrase, or word inscribed on something as appropriate to or indicative of its character or use. Or number two, a short expression of a guiding principle. And I'm really kind of thinking more of the second one, but it could certainly apply to the first definition. It's a short expression of a guiding principle. And that's what I thought about when I thought of making In God We Trust a motto for all believers. Did you know the United States of America has a motto? I'm sure some of you do, maybe some of you don't, but it does have a motto. And that motto is In God We Trust. It's intended to be a guiding principle for our country. It is on all of our currency from the largest denomination, and I wanted to show you this. So somebody asked why I've got all this money sitting on the table. Here's a $100 bill. Now, if I can get this on the camera, see what it says right at the top there? United States of America, In God We Trust. That's the largest denomination that's currently printed by the United States of America. It's also printed on the smallest currency that we have, right? It's called a 1 cent piece. And I got to find it. This one you're not probably going to see, but because I can't get it focused enough, but right above Lincoln's head, it says, "In God we trust." So from our largest currency to our smallest currency, it's the United States motto. For my bank card, you're allowed to put some things or pictures or all that. And so I took a photo of the United States motto. I forget where it was on. Maybe it was on the Capitol building or someplace that I had taken a picture of it. And I wanted to put that picture on my bank card. And I was told, no, we don't allow any phrases or wording to be put on a bank card. I said, it's on all our currency. No, we don't allow that. You cannot put that on there. I said, it's the United States motto. I'm sorry, you cannot put that on your bank card. So it's not on my bank card, obviously. But it's interesting, it was originally proposed, that "In God We Trust" motto was originally proposed to the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, by a minister in a letter that he sent to him in November of, I wrote 1961 in my notes, 1861. It was right at the beginning of the Civil War. Secretary Chase was so inspired to write by the letter that he wrote the director of the Mint in Philadelphia, stating the following. This is what he wrote in his letter. "Dear sir, no nation can be strong except in the strength of God, or safe except in his defense. The trust of our people in God should be declared on all our national coins. You will cause a device to be prepared without unnecessary delay, with a motto expressing in the fewest and tersest words possible this national recognition." So our Secretary of Treasury, during the beginning, at the very beginning of the Civil War, decided that he wanted this motto expressing a trust in God, our strength in God. And they came up with several different mottos, but it was a couple of years later that they finally made some presentations, and Secretary Chase said, "What I want on there is the term 'In God We Trust.'" And it was after that that they started putting it on our coins. Just think of what a different country we'd be living in if every single individual would only acknowledge that very truth each time they made a monetary transaction. The strength isn't in the money or what it can be, it's in God. Have you ever asked yourself, what is my personal motto? What phrase do I call on as my guiding principle in life? "In God We Trust" would be a good one for sure. So what I want to talk about is, how do we build this trust? You know, this is something that trust doesn't just start. We just don't have trust. We just don't trust somebody or something the first time we're around it. I don't think there's a believer anywhere who doesn't want to trust God. But let's be honest, we certainly don't trust him in every situation in our lives. At least I haven't. So why don't we trust him? We don't trust someone we don't know. How well do we know God? You may say, I know God. I've been a believer for many, many years. I've studied his word. I know what it says about God. That may all be true, but knowing someone intellectually is much different than really knowing someone because you've had experience with them. And that's a big difference. Having head knowledge of something or somebody doesn't put trust into it, or doesn't put trust into that individual. When Sheila and I went out on this program, it was an outdoor leadership development program or training program. We actually lived in the wilderness. You did rock climbing and all this stuff. One of the things that we had to do was we had to be tied into a climbing rope and climb, I don't know what it was, you guys were there, probably somewhere between 75 to maybe 125, 150 feet at the most. You're climbing up what looks like a pretty straight wall. And there's a person up top. And what they do is they have the rope, it's not tied into anything, it's kind of wrapped around their waist a little bit, wrapped around the back, and they hang on to that rope and they keep it tight. The reason being is that if you fall, they act as a brake. They take the hand that's holding that brake hand, that's holding that rope, and they pull it into themselves and they lean forward, and that's going to hold you. Now, nothing against Mary Ellen, but if Mary Ellen is at the top of that hill and she's holding that rope, and I'm on the other end, a 200+ pound guy climbing up that hill, I got to have some pretty strong trust when I'm 30, 40, 50, 60 feet up in the air, that if I yell fall, that Mary Ellen's going to be able to hold me. Otherwise, I'll have a very quick descent down to the bottom of that ravine. But you know what? When it's done well, and Mary Ellen is doing her job, which, knowing Mary Ellen, I know she would be very concerned about hanging onto that rope. If I fell, she could hang on to me. Well, there's some trust there. There has to be some trust. Now, if I'd never met Mary Ellen, and again, nothing against Mary Ellen, but I saw her for the first time and they told me, I'm like, there's no way, no way. But because I know Mary Ellen, and I was told by the experts that it could be done, and I trusted them, then I would climb that rope and I would get to the top. And that's exactly what happened. Now, once I got there, guess what? And it proved that out. Then I have some experience actually working with her, but I wouldn't trust her if I didn't know her. So how well do we really know God? We have to have experience with him. You've got to see him in action. They have to prove themselves to have been trustworthy. There's really two basic reasons why we don't trust in God. Either number one, we don't know God, or we don't know enough about God in a particular area to trust him, or we know enough, but for some reason we still refuse to trust in him. So those are the only two reasons I can think about. Either we don't know enough to trust him, or we know enough and we're just not going to do it anyway. I don't care. I'm just not going to trust God. The first one about not knowing enough can be corrected through instruction to overcome ignorance on the topic. And the second one needs to be addressed through correct teaching to overcome the error in our thinking. Now, why do I say that? The error in our thinking. Because if we truly know God and trust and know who God is, the only reason we wouldn't trust God if we know about it is because we're not thinking clearly in an area in our life. I could trust God perfectly in healing and be untrusting God in the areas of finance. So just because I trust God in one area doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to trust God in every area, or that I have trust in God in those areas. So again, either I'm ignorant on the topic and I need to learn about it, or I need to get some correct teaching to fix the error in my own thinking. Is there an area in your life where you don't trust God to take care of your need? He loves you, and he wants to do anything and everything he can for you. You are his child. He sacrificed his only begotten son for you. There is nothing he won't do for you. So let's study some verses to show that God will never let you down. He is worthy of our trust. And I'm going to read a couple verses. And most of these verses I'm going to read, you're all familiar with. But the first one is in Numbers 23, verse 19. And I think most of these verses I'm reading are from the King James Version. God is not a man that he should lie, neither the son of man that he should repent. Hath he said, and shall he not do it? Or hath he spoken, and shall he not make it good? If God has said he's going to do something, if he has promised you anything in the word, he's not like a man where he could shake your hand one day on a deal and lie to you the next. It's not going to be like that. When God makes a promise, when he makes a commitment, he will follow through. He always does. He always will. In Romans 8:28, it says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. All things work together for good. Now, sometimes we don't trust God because as we're going through life, situations come up and we're praying, we're taking, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And then bad things happen to us, negative things happen to us, things that we're like, why is this happening to me? I love God. I think I'm trusting God. Well, we live in a world where sometimes things happen to us. God is not doing those things. We have a spiritual adversary called the devil. He's the one that brought all the evil into the world. He's the arch nemesis against God. Everything that's negative in the world was brought in by the adversary, by the devil. Now that is all going to get straightened out sometime in the future. But until that time, things will happen. But this verse promises that all things work together for good. Doesn't mean that it doesn't say all things are going to be good. All things work together for good. So over time, and at our recent men's weekend, one of the things that I shared on was a retrospective look of 50 years as a believer, and how when I looked over a period of time, sometimes months, sometimes years, sometimes even decades, I could see where God and how God took care of me. Wow, that builds trust in me because I can look back on that pattern and see what God has done for me. But sometimes things weren't good in the middle of it, but they worked out to good. If we endeavor to know God through his word, we will see that he is worthy of our trust, and our trust in him will grow daily. To know him is to trust him. You have to build a foundation of trust. You have to start by building a pattern of trust. You ever hear the old phrase, he bet the farm? You know, maybe it's not a current phrase, but it might be one that you've heard. He bet the farm. It means that someone was willing to risk everything in the hopes that it would work to their favor. When we're learning to trust, sometimes we feel like we're putting everything on the line. So I'm not telling you to bet the farm when it comes to trusting God, but why not bet the pig? I mean, it's only just a little pig. And it won't change your life, right? Why not bet the pig? Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you don't have to put everything on the line. Sometimes just trust God in the little things. When you see how he always takes care of you, then you start to build that trust. You see him in the little things that he'll take care of. The key is not to forget what God has already done for you when you face situations and obstacles in your life, because we're going to get them. Look back at what God did for you in the past as you're facing those kind of obstacles today. Then when the gigantic things in life attack you, there will be a pattern of trust and success in which you can look back on. In 1 Samuel 17, we're going to look at an example of somebody who ran into a gigantic obstacle. His name was Goliath. And David was probably around, I don't know, we think maybe around 17 or so, but he was a young man, probably maybe 20 at the most. And we're going to just read a few verses. I want you to understand first what David was running into. So we're going to 1 Samuel 17, verse 1. We'll read through verse 11. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shako, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shako and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. Again, there's my Kansas words on trying to pronounce these, but basically what they did is there was a valley. Israel was camped on one, and the Philistines were camped on the other. Okay, that's what it was. They were up on either side of this valley. And Saul and them and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched in the valley of Elah and set the battle in array against the Philistines. So they'd been having this fight. Verse 3, and the Philistines stood on the mountain on the other side, on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. I didn't write down all the notes, but they think he could have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 13 feet tall. He was big guy. You ever see the former like world wrestling championships? They used to have some big guys that came out there and they'd carry their big wrestling championship belt. Well, this was Goliath. When he came down, there was no missing Goliath as he started walking down into the valley. I mean, he was definitely head and shoulders above most men. An average man would probably hit him somewhere around his belt line. So kind of figure that's how big he was if you want to get a perception. if I had brought maybe a 5 or 6-year-old or 7-year-old child, he would stand maybe about my belt line, maybe a little lower. That's about how a regular person would stand up against Goliath. So he came down and he was their champion. Nobody had ever, you're only a champion if you've not been beat, right? He'd never been beaten. And he had the helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat of mail was 1,000 shekels of brass. It probably took 2 or 3 men to help him get his armor on. It had greaves of brass upon his legs and a target of brass between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like the weaver's beam. It was huge. And his spears had weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. Can you imagine this man coming down in dressed in all this armor? It says he's talking about brass and all these things, the sun shining down on him, the lights reflecting off of him, and out comes this gigantic man. Nobody had ever beat him. I'm sure they'd heard about this gentleman. It says in verse 8, and he stood and he cried unto the armies of Israel. Now, if you're in a valley and you shout and there's mountains on either side, what does it do? It echoes back and forth. So can you imagine him coming out and goes, why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and you servants to Saul? Come, choose your man and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you be our servants and serve us. So can you imagine these words echoing off the mountains? Come on down and fight me, fight me, fight me, fight me. That's what it would have been like. Wow. Verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistines, they said, you know what? God has done so much for us in all the past. We've got nothing to be afraid of. Let's go show this individual what God can do. No, it says they were dismayed and what? Greatly afraid. The opposite of trust is fear. It's fear. That's the opposite of trust. Israel had seen many victories in their past. Just think about how they had conquered Jericho without even a shot being fired. Yet here they were dismayed and afraid. Why? They had forgotten where to put their trust. They trusted in Saul, and even he was afraid. They should have encouraged one another with all the times that God had saved them. And then David comes in to check on his brothers, and he sees all this going on, and eventually David is brought towards the king. In verse 32 it says, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go down and fight with this Philistine. He had never been in a battle. He had never been in a war. He had been a shepherd. He had been taking care of his sheep. His father sent him down to check on his brothers. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. This man is experienced. You can't find him. Where was Saul encouraging David that they could trust in God, that God would take care of it? All Saul was doing was exclaiming his own fear to David, because it didn't look good if David, this young runt, came up and outdid Saul. Because remember, Saul was head and shoulders above all the men in Israel, and Goliath was head and shoulders above Saul. And David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of Saul. No, the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. Saul finally said it. Whether he believed it or not, don't know. David had built a pattern of trusting God in his life. As a shepherd, his number one priority was to care for the sheep. When the flock was attacked by predators, his responsibility was to defend the sheep. Sheep have no natural defenses like many animals. They can't fight and they can't flee. They are truly a defenseless animal. It's up to the shepherd. David learned through his experiences with the lion and the bear that God would take care of him, and he didn't see why God couldn't and wouldn't deliver him out of this predator's hands too. Did David trust God? Absolutely. Did God let him down? He made David the victor. David became the champion. We build our trust in God the same way that David did. He didn't start out dealing with Goliath, but when Goliath was standing in front of him, he had no doubt about God's willingness and ability. Sometime and some place in each of our lives, we will face a Goliath. Don't wait until you're face to face with them to learn to trust God. Start building that pattern of trusting God now. I'm going to share an incident which probably going to make me a little emotional, but I thought I'd share it anyway. So I'll see if I can work through this. I titled it Nathan's Goliath. So I was standing on the podium teaching at the Weekend the Word in November 2007 when my pager started vibrating on my belt. It kept vibrating while I completed my teaching. When I finished, I walked off the stage and was met by Sheila telling me that we had to leave immediately for the hospital because our son Nathan had had a seizure. We rushed to Northwest Community Hospital in Arlington Heights, Illinois to meet our daughter Carrie in the emergency room. And once we arrived, we were met by the ER physician who told us that according to a CT scan that he believed that Nathan had a large arteriovenous malformation, or AVM, an abnormal connection between the arteries and veins in the brain that usually forms before birth. We had just come to face with our Goliath. When you look at it from a census perspective, it was overwhelming. We just went from a wonderful weekend that our kids were coming to join us to a life-threatening situation. It looked large, terrifying, and menacing. And it only looked worse a week later. This is what I wrote in a letter to a neurosurgeon just a few days later. Nathan has been diagnosed with an arteriovenous malformation, AVM, while inpatient at the Northwest Community Hospital from November 3rd through the 7th, 2007 by doctors Katznelson and Popillo. It was their recommendation that we find a neurosurgeon, specifically at a teaching hospital, to treat the problem. According to their description, the AVM is very large and its complexity was more than they believed they could handle at their facility. They felt the problem would need to be handled by a team of doctors and experts in the field. When you have your son in the hospital, and their chief of neurosurgeon at that hospital says, it's more than I know how to deal with, and I don't know where to send you. You're going to have to go find somebody. That's a Goliath. Nate's situation was so overwhelming for the professionals at the hospital he was first in that they released him to us with no clear recommendation of where we should go or who we should see. On top of everything else, Nate didn't have any health insurance. It was obvious already that this was going to be very, very expensive. And the odds against Nate and us were staggering. What were we to do? There was only one thing we could do, right? Trust in God. Where else could we turn and have the trust that our son would receive the healing and get the care that he needed, regardless of the circumstances? Our family pulled together, and collectively we trusted that God would provide whatever was needed, and of course he did. Nate is literally living proof of that trust. The story is much too long to cover at this time, but I will say that God opened the door for Nate to get the world's foremost expert neurosurgeon who specialized in AVMs. His medical bills were covered so that no one had to pay the estimated $1 million plus in medical costs. And his recovery happened so rapidly that he was dubbed the walking miracle by going through his rehabilitation program. Sheila and I, along with our children, have built a pattern of believing God and trust over the years. We've seen God come through on the little things and the bigger things, and knowing that allowed us to collectively trust God when the life and death challenge was staring us right in the face. We never could have figured it out on our own. It was a step-by-step and day-by-day journey, just knowing that God could get us to where we needed to be. Hopefully, you don't have to go through those kind of challenges. But you know, if it's there, you can't run away from it. You know, Saul and David, they couldn't run away. Well, Saul tried. They tried to hide. But David went and faced the Goliath. And at times, Goliath is staring you in the face and you have to take it down. Well, if you don't have God, where else are you going to go? You know, I don't know how people do it without God. Maybe, I'm sure they get through it, but I don't know how. I want to take a look at another very, very difficult situation in the Word, and it's dealing with Jesus. Jesus had to learn to trust in God. He had to learn of his Father. He was not God. He was born a man. So he had the same kind of feelings and emotions and distrusts and everything else that we had that he had to learn to overcome. He would have studied men like David and others to see how they learned to build their trust. Jesus always did the Father's will, but he was a man and he had to decide in each and every situation in his life whether or not he would put his trust in God. Have you ever thought about what it took for Jesus to trust God when it came to his torture and crucifixion? He would have read about what was going to be done to him, about all that he had to go through, yet trust that God would still raise him from the dead 3 days and 3 nights later. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 26, and I'm going to jump around on a couple of the verses here. Just don't have time to read all of them. In Matthew 26, in verse 36, it says, "Then cometh Jesus with them unto a place called Gethsemane, and said unto the disciples, Sit ye here while I go and pray yonder." In verse 38, they said unto them, My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry here and watch with me. When you're so grieved that it says you can barely stand it, he was asking them to pray with him. Well, we know from the records they were that the tension was so strong that they just fell asleep. They couldn't deal with it. They couldn't deal with it, and the way they dealt with it was that they just fell asleep. In verse 39, it says, "And he went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt." Verse 42, "And he went again the second time and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. And in verse 44, "And he left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words." Jesus was experiencing great grief, anguish, and distress. Wouldn't you if you knew your death it was going to be a most horrific one and it was imminent? It was just literally hours away. He wanted to know if there was any alternative to achieve God's will in this situation. Yet his desire was to trust God and to do his will. He prayed this 3 times. You ever ask why he prayed 3 times? Wasn't once enough? Now, I understand the Orientalism about constraining, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. I think there's more to it than he just went because it was an Oriental custom to ask 3 times. His life was on the line. He wasn't going, oh, I got to meet the Oriental custom, so I'll ask God 3 times and then I'll know and I'll move on. That's not what he was in his mind. He was going, God, is there any way I don't have to go through all this? He was going to feel every lash that they threw against him. He was going to feel every thorn they drove into his head. He was going to hear every insult that was thrown against him. He was going to feel the nails that were driven through his hands and through his feet. He was going to feel all that. He was going to experience all that. He knew what he was going to have to go through. This wasn't an Orientalism that he was dealing with. He was talking about his life and what he had to endure. Why did he pray 3 times? Because I think he needed to be convinced in his own mind that if he was going to go through this, that he would be able to make it all the way through to the very end. Because had he quit any time along that time, there would have been no salvation for any of us. Wouldn't happen. So why did he do that? It wasn't because he didn't trust God. He had trusted God so many times all along. This one time now he's going to say, oh, I don't trust you, God. I don't believe that's the case. It's because he had to be convinced that it was what he needed to do, and it was a confirmation of his trust in the Father. Once he left after that 3rd time, he was convinced that that was it. This was it. And he was ready to face whatever was going to be thrown against him. In Luke 22, we'll read another record about this. In verse 41, it says, and he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And there also appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. God will do whatever it takes to help us what we need. Here, Jesus needed, I don't know what the strengthening is. Maybe maybe that with the devil attacking him, maybe what he needed was the angel to come down and just encourage him. It was maybe a recognition that God was there. Look, I'm right here with you. God is spirit. He couldn't come down. And he sent his angel. Verse 44, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling to the ground. The intensity of his prayer was illustrated by this figure of speech, that it was as if he was sweating drops of blood. It represents an intensity in his prayers. He submitted himself to the will of God. He put his complete trust in his will and the purposes of God. And when he left that garden, there was no doubt in his mind. He had confidence, trust, and faith in what God had called him to do. What an amazing example of trust. He was carrying all the sins of mankind to that cross. He knew what was at stake, and he could have called on 12 legions of angels at any time for God to take care of him. He made that comment after he had prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. You think maybe the angel had come down and said, look, Jesus, at any time you want out of here, all you got to do is call me and I'll bring 12 legions of angels and I'm out of here. Jesus made that comment after he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus knew. He's telling his disciples now, you think I can't pray and I can have this taken care of? I can stop this anytime I want to. But his trust was in God. He was absolutely convinced. Maybe at times we have to pour out our soul to God, lay it all out before him. I know all our family did that with Nathan. There were nights I couldn't even sleep. I just prayed. Not because I was afraid, but I just needed to lay out my heart before God. And I wasn't trying to convince God to heal my son either. That's not the reason I was praying. God already told me, we already knew from the word, he wanted Nate healed, right? I wasn't trying to convince God to heal my son. And I think sometimes when we pray, sometimes that's what we do. We're trying to convince God. God doesn't need convincing. We need convincing, right? I was building my own confidence in the promises of God so I could go forth and do what needed to be done. Jesus pushed through the most difficult and dire situation because he was absolutely convinced that he would end in victory. I wonder if when Jesus woke up in the tomb, there was a big smile on his face? And why wouldn't there be? He got the victory. He stayed faithful. He trusted in God. Trusting in God doesn't mean we won't have difficult times, but we can't quit when it gets tough. Trust God to see you through. He will. We can learn to trust God as we see how he has proven himself to be trustworthy in our lives and in the lives of others. In 1 Kings 8:56, it says, "Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel according to all that he promised. Not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he spoke by Moses, his servant." Not one word God has failed. So let me ask the question, what's the alternative? If you're not going to trust God, who or what are you going to trust? I really like the answer I read online. One reason to trust God is that we really have no sensible alternative. Should we trust in ourselves or in others who are sinful, unpredictable, unreliable, have limited wisdom, and frequently make bad choices and decisions swayed by emotion? Or do we trust in the all-wise, all-knowing, all-powerful, gracious, merciful, loving God who has good intentions for us? The choice should be obvious. But if we fail to trust God because we don't know him, as already stated, we cannot hope to trust in someone who is essentially a stranger to us, but that is easily remedied. God has not made himself difficult to find or know. All we need to know about God, he has graciously made available to us in the Bible, his holy word to his people. To know God is to trust him. God is trustworthy. He is the only one we can trust, not ourselves, not others, not our government, not our religion. There's nothing. We want to get to the point where we can truly make our motto, "In God we trust." Have you ever wondered what verses Jesus might have been running through his mind that night in the Garden of Gethsemane? I have. Perhaps these could have been on his mind that night in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1-7. And I'm going to read this from the Amplified, and we'll close on these verses. "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life worth living, and tranquility and prosperity, the wholeness of life's blessing, they will add to you. Do not let mercy and kindness and truth leave you. Instead, let these qualities define you. Bind them securely around your neck. Write them upon the tablet of your heart. So find favor, high esteem in the sight of God and man. Trust in and rely confidently on the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight or understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge and in all your ways, know and acknowledge and recognize him, and he will make your path straight and smooth, removing obstacles that block your way. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord with reverent awe and obedience, and turn entirely away from evil." When we remember and keep God's will in our minds and hearts, knowing all that he has done, is doing, and will do for us, it's the foundation for trust. This is where trust starts and how it builds. We are to secure those things God does for us around our neck and inscribe them in the innermost part of our being, our heart. This is where trust comes from. Trust comes from the heart, not from the brain. We don't intellectually trust. I can look at, if I was going to bungee jump, off of this bridge, hundreds of feet down to the ground, and maybe I'm only going to be a few feet off the ground when I land, I can intellectually understand the scientific and the mathematics and everything that's involved about that. I can understand that, but am I going to jump off the bridge? No, I'm not jumping off the bridge. Why? Because intellectually I understand it, but in my heart, I'm not going off that bridge. I don't care how many times I've seen it. It's not anything that's going to convince me to do. So trust comes from the heart, not from the mind. Believing comes from the heart, not from the mind. Trust comes from the heart also. Once we built it in our heart, then we can finally be able to trust and rely confidently on the Lord with what? All of our heart. We are never to rely on our own insight or understanding. How often? Never, never, never are we to rely on that. Once we trust and rely on God, then what? In our actions, in everything we do, acknowledge and recognize him. We can put the trust in our heart, but then we have to put it into action. If you're not acting, you're not trusting. In everything we do, we acknowledge and recognize him. In God we trust. It's actions, not thoughts. And when we do this, God will make our path straight and smooth. So you mean to say that I'll never have any more problems in my life? No, it means that those things in your mind and life that take you off track and cause you to stumble or block your way will finally be removed. When we trust in God with all our heart, the obstacles being removed are not the ones that we're going to face in our life. They're the ones that we put in our own mind in our own lives. We are our own worst enemy at times. I said, you're finally going to take your big fat foot off the hose and allow the full blessings of God to follow. Remember that analogy? Why aren't the blessings of God flowing? Because a lot of times we're standing on the hose. Get your big fat foot off the hose. Trust God, let him do it. The final verse that we just read tells us not to get too arrogant once things start going well. Good or bad, we trust in God. The evil it's referring to, it says, do not be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. The evil it's referring to is to go back to our own ways and to trust in our own selves. Let's keep our trust focused in God. Let's make it the believer's motto, your motto, in God we trust. Heavenly Father, in the name of Jesus Christ, thank you for this word. Thank you, Father, that we can trust you and that we can believe in you. And Father, that you just bring everything to pass because we know that you never let one of your words fall. And we just claim all this and so thankful for it in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.